We're just getting ready to start.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fisher-Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback, maybe on your Karen audio. So let me see.
Is that me?
If I can mute Karen for a second, see if that helps. Karen, you might have two windows open. Just check your computer and let me circle back to you in a second. So we're glad everybody could join us as we figure out our tech issues here. For those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training and facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and policy. And we are pleased to be co-hosting tonight's conversation with AU's First Ladies Initiative, which seeks to highlight the significant contributions of America's First Ladies. And so there is no doubt that the subject of tonight's discussion, Nancy Reagan, is among the most influential and powerful presidential spouses in history. Yet there's still so much we don't know about Nancy Reagan until now, thanks to our guest tonight, longtime journalist with the Washington Post, Karen Tumulty, who has just written a thoroughly reported new biography of Nancy Reagan called The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. And before we start, I'm going to let everybody know that we're going to save plenty of time for questions. On the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a button that says Ask a Question. So please feel free to do so during the course of our discussion. And you will also be able to upvote questions from others that you are interested in as well. And then if you miss any of the discussion and you want to share it with friends, the replay is going to be available at the same link that you used to register. And so as I mentioned, we're happy to co-host tonight's Women on Wednesdays with the First Ladies Initiative, and especially thrilled the director of the initiative, our friend Anita McBride, is here tonight as well. And Anita, as I'm sure many of you know, is the former chief of staff for First Lady Laura Bush. And earlier in her career, she was the director of presidential personnel for Ronald Reagan and later for George H.W. Bush. So Anita, we'd love to have you set the stage a little bit for tonight's discussion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I'm delighted to be here, and good evening again to you, Karen, and to everyone that is watching tonight. This is a topic that, of course, is very near and dear to my heart, as Betsy said, having served directly as a chief of staff for First Lady, but having worked in 3 presidential administrations and really seeing up close, a front row seat to really the power of this platform of a First Lady. And I'm so delighted to be co-hosting this with Betsy's Women in Politics Institute tonight, because the First Ladies Initiative at American University, which was established about 10 years ago, is really dedicated to the study of these women who have served in this very unique role, not a statutory role, no salary, no constitutional authority, yet it is a powerful platform. And each of them have used it differently, but they have made a mark on history. And we look at that influence on American politics, on public policy, and in global diplomacy. And this book that Karen Tumulty has written is really, there is a reason why Doris Kearns Goodwin, the brilliant historian, calls this the gold standard of First Lady biographies. I have read many, and this one is incredible. The depth of research that really helps bring to light the complicated personality and complex personality of Nancy Davis Reagan, a very controversial First Lady, but a consequential one too, and in areas that people really cannot fully appreciate until they read Karen's book, and that is in the area of foreign policy. So I hope that this will pique your interest in First Ladies, their role in our history, the mark that they have made. You can go on our website at american.edu/First Ladies. There's an enormous resources list of some of the best books and videos and materials that are out there, of which I was so happy to recently add Karen Tumulty's book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. So now I'm going to turn it over to Betsy and to Karen, and I know you're in for a treat, and you will learn a lot, things you never knew, things I didn't know, and I knew Mrs. Reagan.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks so much for providing us with a good way to set the scene for tonight. And thanks for being here, for all the work that you do at American.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay. So Karen, let's start. Tell us a little bit about what you hope people will take away from this. Anita mentioned sort of the complexities of Nancy Reagan. Tell us what you hope readers will take away from this book.
Well, thank you, first of all, for hosting this tonight. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And of course, Anita is the world's foremost expert on the subject of these remarkable women who have served as First Lady. What I really hope people will do is what I had to do, which is set aside all your presumptions about Nancy Reagan. She was a controversial, very polarizing figure. The country, I think, made up their minds about her, pro and con, decades ago. But as I began working, this book took me 4.5 years.
Wow.
As I began working on it, I realized, yes, she was a very flawed individual. She had her demons, but her impact on the rise of one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, her impact on the success of his presidency, and I'm not talking about pillow talk or being his closest advisor. She was quite literally the only human being in the world to whom Ronald Reagan was truly close. But she had her impact on some of the biggest policy achievements of his presidency, starting with the end of the Cold War. And I opened the book, in fact, on a story that George Shultz, who served as Secretary of State for most of the Reagan presidency, told me. I don't know, Betsy, should I go?
Let's
So George Shultz, 97 years old when I interviewed him, tells me a story about how shortly after 7 months after he becomes Secretary of State, he doesn't really know the Reagans all that well. In fact, he was passed over the first time for Alexander Haig because Nixon said, pick Al Haig as your Secretary of State. So Haig gets fired, Shultz comes in, but he doesn't really know Reagan all that well. Washington gets sucked in by one of the biggest blizzards of the century in February of 1983. Shultz is coming back from a trip that included a stop in China. As the city begins to dig out, Nancy Reagan calls him up on a Saturday afternoon and says, why don't you and your wife come over for dinner tonight? It'll just be the four of us. So Shultz gets over there for dinner, and it begins as what he thinks is a social evening. And then all of a sudden, both Reagans start pounding him with questions about the Chinese. What are they like as people? Do they have a bottom line? From there, Reagan starts talking about the Soviet Union and his own ideas for engaging them. This is all a revelation to George Shultz. What he knows about Ronald Reagan is that this guy has decades of hardline anti-communist rhetoric. All of his advisors, with the exception of a few figures like Shultz, are real hardliners who believe there could never be any such thing as a working relationship with Moscow. Ronald Reagan is presiding over the biggest peacetime military buildup in history. And yet Shultz says it suddenly, he realizes this man has never had a conversation with a big time communist leader, and he is dying to have one. And at that same moment, Shultz realizes that was the whole reason Nancy invited him over that night. She wanted Shultz away from the National Security Council, away from people like Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, so that he could hear directly from Reagan himself that along with this hatred of communism. There was an idealism that he really believed that there could be a world without nuclear weapons, that he had the negotiating skills to make it happen. And he realizes, like I said, that was the whole point of this supposedly social dinner. He also realizes at this moment that he has found an absolutely invaluable ally in this first lady who knows and understands her husband like nobody else on the planet does. As he told me, I always figured anybody with any brains would make friends of the first lady. That puts Shultz and a few other figures like James Baker in a minority. Nancy Reagan didn't set foot in the West Wing very often, but if she was upset about something, everybody knew it. And people who were not in her favor tended not to last for very long. She is one of the main reasons that Ronald Reagan went through a half dozen national security advisors.
Yeah, I mean, you write in the book that her forays into the West Wing were really greeted with terror. And she's this tiny little woman, and yet she instilled this sort of sense of terror around her because she was so involved in kind of the personnel and the people.
And as James Baker told me, again, James Baker, another outsider, he barely knows the Reagans when he is named first White House chief of staff. He gets the job, he tells me, because Nancy Reagan wanted him there, as opposed to everybody thought the job was going to go to Edwin Meese, a far more ideological advisor to Reagan who had been his chief of staff in California. But, you know, Nancy Reagan she really clicks with James Baker. She wants a pragmatist in the job. And Baker said, you know, if you could convince her that something was in the president's best interest, you stood a pretty good chance of getting him aboard. Now, his successor, Don Regan, doesn't feel that way. He thinks Nancy is just a big pain in the neck. He clashes with her. She ultimately gets him fired.
And she worked for a while diligently to make that happen. You go through sort of, you know, the back and forth of that and, you know, leaking to the press about certain things. I mean, she really worked that.
Yeah, and it's the height of the Iran-Contra scandal. Yeah. The other thing she has is she has Ronald Reagan couldn't stand confrontation. She has a far superior nose for trouble than her genitally optimistic husband. And when Iran-Contra, the biggest scandal to hit his presidency, happens, she decides this calls for a complete White House shakeup, starting at the top with the chief of staff. Reagan doesn't want to do it. And they spend many, many weeks. They were a real married couple arguing. And Jim Coon, who was Reagan's personal assistant, his executive assistant, tells me of a scene where they're at Camp David. Jim Coon is working where he normally works, which is this little kind of desk near the pantry in the kitchen. And the Reagans are in the living room just going at it over Don Regan. At one point, Reagan screams. And again, Coon said he'd never heard the president raise his voice like this. He screams, "Get off my goddamn back." At which point, Coon sort of scoops up his papers, scoops up his folders.
I'm out of here.
Out of there.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about Don Regan, that leads us to sort of what I think was sort of hung over her time as First Lady, and sort of the top line thing that people remember about her is astrology, right? And he is the one that got his revenge when he published his memoirs and disclosed the influence that this astrologer in San Francisco had over a lot of different aspects of the president's schedule. So what did you learn about that? And then and why that was so important to her? And I guess talk a little bit about, you know, the assassination attempt too, you know, that really, you know, put in her mind the sense that she was constantly worried that something was going to happen.
Well, so first of all, you have to understand, you know, show business is by nature a superstitious business. And back in the 40s and the 50s, a lot of the biggest stars in Hollywood would dabble in astrology. There was one guy, Carol Reiter, he was the astrology columnist for the LA Times. He would have these star of the month parties and everybody would show up, but it was really just kind of a little, sort of fun thing. But Nancy Reagan, and I trace this back to the traumas of her childhood, has this incredibly anxious personality. She always believes that no matter how good things are going, the bottom could drop out at any moment. And certainly that does seem to be confirmed in the 2 months into her husband's presidency, where she comes very close to losing him to an assassin's bullet. Now, and of course, we now know he was far closer to death than the White House let anybody know at the time.
Right.
Ronald Reagan comes out of this with a religious faith that was imbued in him by his mother. He believes that God preserved him for a reason. It's also, by the way, one of the first things he does as he's recovering is writes a letter to then Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev saying, "You and I are the only two people in the world who could start World War III, and we're the only two people who could stop it." So, he is believing God has a plan for him. Nancy Reagan does not come from that religious tradition. Her adoptive father, who she worshiped, was an atheist. She is just desperate for anything that can give her a sense of control. In fact, in the chapter about the assassination attempt, at one point, I try to take the reader minute by minute by minute of what the horror that day was for her. So, but she comes out of it racked with anxiety, convinced that every time her husband sets foot outside the White House, there is somebody out there waiting to finish off the job that John Hinckley started. So shortly afterward, she is talking to her friend Merv Griffin, the talk show host, entertainment executive, also big astrology fan, shares a July 6th birthday with her. And he tells Nancy Reagan, there's this woman in San Francisco who knew that was a bad day for him to set foot outside the White House. Nancy hangs up the phone almost immediately, calls up Joan Quigley, who becomes really an emotional crutch for her. But yes, a lot of the scheduling decisions in the White House had to be run past her. And in the first term, they are kept secret. They are all handled through Deputy Chief of Staff Michael Deaver, and nobody could understand why the scheduling operation was always a mess. And Deaver would come back and say, wait, Air Force One has to take off at 2:02 a.m. from Andrews. And it's like, why? And it's just tell the press it's about jet lag. But Deaver leaves at the end of the first term. The scheduling operation has to go through another guy named William Hinkle. And Don Regan is just on his case, like, why is it always a mess? So finally, Hinkle, who's been let in on the secret, says, we've got to take this to Regan. And so Regan keeps a desk calendar with every day is marked like with traffic stop colors. There are green days, yellow days, red days. When Nancy gets him fired during Iran-Contra, he does get his revenge with a book that comes out while Ronald Reagan is still in office that essentially blows the whistle on this secret that it just seems like almost too wacky to believe when it comes out. Now, did Joan Quigley, as she would later claim she did, influence policy? I'm skeptical. But I do think that she had a big say in determining, does the president give a press conference today? Does he give this speech here?
Because in many ways, and you allude to this in the book too, the schedule is in many ways policy.
And that's the other thing that's so weird and contradictory about that, because if what her fear is for her husband, if what Nancy Reagan's fear is for her husband's security, what could be more foolhardy than giving a woman in San Francisco, who she's only met a couple of times in person, the ability to determine what time the most powerful man in the world comes and goes.
Right. Or if he even does.
Right.
Yeah. So take us back. I mean, you alluded to her childhood there. Tell us how Anne Frances Robbins, which is what her name was when she was born, becomes Nancy Davis Reagan, and that tumultuous childhood that she had that eventually, settled down when her mom got remarried. But she had several years of her life there where she was essentially abandoned by her mother.
Yes, she is born in 1921, though she would later claim it was 1923. And she was the product of a bad match between a very ambitious actress, Edith Luckett, and Kenneth Robbins, a sort of not very successful car salesman. By the time the baby arrives, this marriage is already over with. And as soon as Nancy is out of diapers, her mother essentially dumps her with relatives. You can still see the house in downtown Bethesda. And this child spends the next 6 years just yearning for this absent mother. And Sidwell Friends School, where Nancy went to school for a few years, actually has a tiny 2-sentence composition she wrote in 1928. She's a kindergartner, where all the other kindergartners are writing about their pets or, their goldfish. Yeah. And this little tiny girl offers this fantasy of an intact family and how lonely her own reality is. She writes, "A mommy and a daddy take their little girl to a garden, and they looked for flowers, but there was not a flower to be found." It's just a sort of weirdly profound thing for a tiny child to be writing. But anyway, after 6 years, Edith Luckett comes back, informs Nancy she has met this man she is going to marry. He's a neurosurgeon, if you can imagine, in the 1920s, what a medical pioneer that made him, and that they are all going to move to Chicago. And so enters the second most important man ever in Nancy's life. Her mother's husband is not a warm and fuzzy guy. People didn't like him. Nancy worshiped him. Mm-hmm. He doesn't adopt her. She has to engineer her own adoption when she's a teenager. But the other thing that happens is that Edith, Loyal Davis is a brilliant man of medicine, but it is Edith who, with her networking skills, engineers their rise through Chicago society. And she keeps all of her show business friends around. I mean, people like Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, they're all just kind of wandering through Nancy's childhood constantly. Her godmother, by the way, was at the time the most highly paid actress in the world, a woman whose name you may not have ever heard. I didn't. Alla Nazimova, a silent screen actress who was also living a very open life as a lesbian. So anyway, what happens is Edith first scars this child by abandoning her, does come back and sort of redeems her childhood, but just as importantly, and as Nancy's stepbrother, Richard, told me, really gives her the model for the kind of marriage where 1 + 1 could be so much more than 2. It's really Edith who has the plans that advance their ambitions. And so I actually begin the book with a quote I found deeply buried in one of Lou Cannon's biographies of Reagan. In fact, Lou Cannon later told me he didn't remember writing this sentence, but he wrote, "Ronald Reagan always knew where he wanted to go, but Nancy had a better sense of what it was going to take to get there."
It's fascinating too, because you write about her having that sort of early warning system and how she actually did that. I mean, Reagan himself not a person that was on the phone talking to lots of different people, but Nancy on the phone constantly, watching poll numbers, reading all of the coverage, talking back to her Hollywood friends, talking to people constantly. And she really was sort of the gatherer of information.
And where Ronald Reagan kind of trusted everybody, he was very generous with second chances. When he decides to run for governor, his campaign manager is a guy named Stu Spencer, has lunch with Ronald Reagan's Hollywood agent, Taft Schreiber, who said, if he's running for office, you're going to have to find somebody else who can fire people because this man is completely incapable of it. But where he trusted everybody, Nancy trusted nobody.
Yeah.
And the minute she felt that somebody had betrayed her husband's trust, no matter how long they had worked for him, no matter how loyal they had been, I mean, she was like, it's time for that person to go.
And she also had her own rivalries, especially with some other political spouses. You write about her relationship with Betty Ford, of course, the infamous feuds with her and Barbara Bush, and even Raisa Gorbachev. What is it with her and some of these other political spouses that she has these sort of long-standing feuds with?
Well, I think in some cases, they go back to politics. In Betty Ford's case, their two husbands had fought tooth and nail over the Republican nomination in 1976. Ronald Reagan almost wins it against a sitting president. Betty Ford is seen as the new model of a feminist. She supports the ERA, even though her husband's White House is against it. She is pro-choice. And Betty Ford, during the 76 convention, says of Nancy Reagan, oh, poor Nancy Reagan, she used to be a career woman, but then she met Ronnie and she just fell apart. So, you know, again, these two women, their husbands' ambitions clashed, as George Will told me in explaining the problems with Barbara Bush. You know, sometimes it's easier for the principals to let go of these than it is for the spouse.
Spouses, yeah. Talk to us a little bit about how Nancy Reagan was as a mother, and the relationship that she had with her two children, Ron Reagan and Patty Davis, and as well as her two stepchildren.
This is the most dysfunctional family imaginable. And I have many chapters in the book where I keep returning to this, that the Reagans are so closely bound together as a couple. And Patty even talks about this at her mother's funeral, that they are a closed circle and there's really no room for anyone else, including their children. And as Nancy Reagan herself would acknowledge, she would write in her memoir, all I ever wanted was to be a good wife and mother, and I guess I succeeded more at one than the other. And her dedication of her memoir says something to the effect of, to Ronnie, who always understood, and to my children, who I hope will understand. And again, this is excruciatingly painful. Patty and Michael Reagan being the adopted son from the first marriage to Jane Wyman, did not speak to me for this book, but they wrote their own books and I used them heavily. Ron Reagan, I found to be incredibly insightful about his mother, and he shared many, many hours of thoughts with me. I benefited from Dennis Ravel, who is the widower of Maureen Reagan, and also Nancy's stepbrother, who was the son of Loyal Davis, her adopted father's first marriage, also had just a lot of thoughts, and he was very, very forthcoming with me. In fact, he told me not once, but twice, he said, well, you know, if you want this to be a good book, you can't just write the nice things. So
Talk to us a little bit about some of the other sources that you were able to talk to, and how you went about the process of having access to her files in the library, and then also her personal files as well.
Yeah, I had never done anything in a presidential library, and so I didn't really understand the process. I honestly did not know all that much about the Reagans, but in a presidential library, there is the stuff that they have to show you because the National Archives has gone through it independently, and they say, okay, these are official records of the presidency. Mm-hmm. They are in the public domain. If we haven't cataloged them yet, just file a FOIA. We'll turn them right over to you. The really interesting stuff, is the stuff that doesn't make it into the public records. And those are the property of the Reagan Foundation. And it is basically up to them whether they show them to you. And in some cases, they would send me into a room. They would give me a pad. They would give me a pencil, not a pen. I was allowed to take notes. I was not allowed to copy anything. And on the way out, I would have to turn over my own notes to them. And they would then send them to me. But I found such remarkable things, including in some cases, just boxes of stuff that was just randomly, it was clear to me, scooped out of the Reagan's final residence and sort of just jammed into boxes. It was clear somebody had gone through it and put things in files, but I don't think people had read them. So I found, among other things, a 4-page handwritten letter that had never seen the light of day. Ronald Reagan writing on White House stationery a deathbed letter to his atheist father-in-law, who will be dead within 3 weeks, begging him to accept God before he dies. And in these 4 pages of handwritten letter is the most perfect distillation of Reagan's religious faith imaginable. There, in that same box, was a letter his mother had written in 1937 informing her friends back in Dixon, Illinois, that Ronald has gotten a contract from Warner Pictures. There is a letter in pencil that his mother wrote in 1911, the year he was born. There is an entire box of reactions to the Kitty Kelly biography of Nancy that comes out in the early 90s. And at one point, I pick up this lavender colored envelope that says it's from Paris. And I pull out a letter from Marlene Dietrich, who I wasn't even aware was still alive in the early 1990s, where she is telling Nancy Reagan to sue the heck out of Simon & Schuster, Kitty Kelly's publisher, also my publisher. And, there was just so much kind of interesting stuff like that. Letters from her adoptive father as her mother is descending into Alzheimer's, describing what his life was like and how overwhelmed he was. It was just remarkable. And the diary from the shipboard romance where her mother meets Loyal Davis in 1927. I mean, it was just like,
that's incredible.
You just sort of dig and dig and dig, and you go through thousands of pages that you will never, ever use or care about to just occasionally strike gold.
That's amazing. We have a question about the Just Say No initiative, which I wanted to get to anyway. So, talk to us about that legacy that she left and what kind of contribution that made to Reagan's presidency and to the issue at large.
Well, so Nancy Reagan has a completely disastrous first year.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously everything's overwhelmed by the assassination attempt, but she also, in the middle of a recession, redecorates the White House on private contributions, buys expensive new china, is discovered to be borrowing designer clothes and not turning them back. And so by the end of the first year, she begins to realize that her image is becoming a big problem for her husband, and that if he is going to succeed, she's going to have to succeed. And part of that is finding a cause. So she had, in fact, always been interested in drug use among the young. Now, mind you, these were people raising teenagers in the 1960s when the drug culture, was a problem for a lot of families around the country. And Nancy Reagan really believes that, part of this is just getting the message into kids' heads at a very, very young age. Just say no, and this is today viewed skeptically, cynically, but she did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Just Say No events around the country. She was on television. She really was pounding this message. It is, skeptics would now say, oh, this was just sort of family-friendly cover for the fact that the Reagan administration is treating drug use as a criminal issue. They are incarcerating, disproportionate numbers of men of color. They are cutting social programs that deal with drug treatment and prevention. But I can tell you, because I looked at the research, there was in fact a huge shift in the 1980s. There's something called the Monitoring the Future project that tracks this. The way kids felt about drugs in the 70s, well, it's not a big deal if my friends are smoking marijuana. It really changes in the 80s. It changes back in the 90s when Nancy Reagan is off the scene. And one of the big fans of Just Say No was Joe Califano. I mean, we're not talking about a Republican here. He was LBJ's top domestic policy advisor. He was Jimmy Carter's health secretary. And he now runs a center at Columbia University on substance abuse. And he said it was exactly the message that people should have been pounding into their kids' ears. He put Nancy on his board. She also does some things that do not go over well with her husband's administration. She gives a speech at the UN at a time when the Reagan administration is trying to contend our entire drug problem is from overseas. Nancy Reagan stands up in front of the UN and says, wait a minute, if we're going to be blaming a campesino in Peru or a poppy grower in Afghanistan, we cannot be letting the investment banker who goes out and scores some cocaine on his lunch hour off the hook. And George Shultz, who was with her, she gives this speech, told me that the administration went bananas over this. They tried to talk her into dialing this back. It was completely at odds with their own message, but that afterwards, a lot of UN representatives from other countries come up to Nancy Reagan and thank her for really giving an actual, full, realistic picture of both the supply and the demand issue on drug abuse.
And you mentioned, the rough start of the administration, those first 2 years with China and the clothes, and her relationship with the press. And I love the story of how she essentially was able to turn that around a little bit with her spoof of herself at the Gridiron Dinner. Tell us about that.
Well, sure. And if I had ever met Nancy Reagan, if I could ask her one question, it would be, how could somebody who was so shrewd and so on target about her husband's image have been so clueless about her own? I mean, she really brings a lot of these problems on herself. But going into this second year, when they are really trying to sort of retool her image, this is when the big controversy blows up, because it is discovered she's been borrowing all these designer clothes and not returning them. And the Gridiron Dinner is this dinner that happens once a year here in Washington. It's a white tie dinner. It's a press organization. It is an evening of skits and songs and it's a throwback to the Grover Cleveland, quite literally. But of course they know it's going to be impossible for the Gridiron to resist this freshman.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the White House, Sheila Tate, Nancy's press secretary, finds out that they are going to perform this song where an actress pretends to be Nancy, and to the tune of Secondhand Rose, the old Fanny Brice song, sings Secondhand Clothes. So they decide they can't let this go unanswered. So they come up with their own version of the song. They rehearse it in secret. She doesn't even tell her husband that she's doing about this. Her social secretary comes up with the most god-awful outfit you could imagine: a big feathered hat, a feather boa, rain boots, flowered skirt. Anyway, as the actress is performing the spoof on stage during the Gridiron dinner, Nancy Reagan disappears from the head table. And it sets off a buzz. Everybody's going, oh my God, she must have been so
mad. She left. Yeah.
The next thing they know, there's a rack of clothes wheeled across the stage. The clothes split, and this tiny woman in this outlandish outfit steps through the clothes, and people suddenly realize who it is. It's Nancy. And the room explodes. She sings a version of the same song, Secondhand Clothes, and the final, I don't remember the whole thing, but the final line is, I sure hope Edme sews. Standing ovation. She takes a dish that looks like her controversial White House china, throws it to the ground, another standing ovation. But then people start yelling for an encore. She doesn't have one. So she just does the whole thing over again. This time when she throws down the dish, it shatters into a gazillion pieces. Ronald Reagan gets up to give his own speech, and he says, well, I came here a happy husband, but it looks like I'm leaving a stage door Johnny.
It seemed out of character for her to be so self-depreciating. That things must have been so bad she felt she really needed to do that.
That she even had a sense of humor at all.
Yeah.
A revelation too.
But you don't see that in many other instances with her, right?
You know, it's really funny. A number of people told me, including Edmund Morris, the Reagan biographer, that really of the two of them, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, you know, Reagan, as affable as he was, as gifted at connecting with the country, was really a pretty remote figure. And that Nancy was actually kind of better company. She was inquisitive. She had a really deep laugh at the ready. And, you know, again, if you were on her bad side, she was terrifying, but she could be a good friend. And she really was just incredibly curious about people. And when William Novak, who becomes the co-author of her memoir, starts to interview, he said, it was impossible for me to get her to talk about herself because she just kept asking me questions. And she was just like that. She was just this gatherer of information.
Here's a question from Caitlin. She says, what was something that surprised you the most when you were conducting your research?
You know, it was really how complex she was. And that, like, as many layers as you peel back on this woman, there are just more and more layers to be found. But if I can tell you my single favorite tiny bit of trivia from my book research, and it's just one sentence in the book. So Nancy Davis comes to Hollywood, a not very accomplished actress, in 1949. But for reasons that I explain in the book, Spencer Tracy sets up her screen test so she cannot fail. She gets the contract in 1949. And because MGM, the powerhouse of Hollywood studios, has just offered a contract to Nancy Davis, they take a pass on another actress named Marilyn Monroe. It has to be the absolute worst decision ever by any Hollywood studio.
Wow, that's amazing. Here's a question from Sydney. She says, despite her influential role in the White House, have you found that younger women are somehow less receptive to Nancy Reagan? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
That was the case in her life, too.
Yeah.
The harshest stories about her were written by younger women journalists. And as Katharine Graham, the owner and publisher of the Washington Post, very close friend of Nancy Reagan, tells her, she says, you represent everything they are rebelling against. It is really not until her husband is out of office, becomes incapacitated by Alzheimer's, and it falls upon Nancy Reagan to become not only the caretaker and protector of his physical well-being and dignity, but really the shaper and protector of his legacy. Mm-hmm. And I think as the country sees just the stoicism and the devotion she had to that, people do begin to realize that look that she had of adoration that was known as the gaze that she had fixed on him for all those years, it was genuine. And that this, I do think that people at the end of her life, and she does some brave things, including coming out in favor of stem cell research at a time when George W. Bush is cutting back on it. It involves the destruction of fetal embryos. And when she stands up and opposes the Bush administration on this, Michael Deaver says, some conservative Republican on Capitol Hill calls him and says, Ronald Reagan would never have supported this, to which Michael Deaver replies, Ronald Reagan hasn't had to take care of Ronald Reagan for the last 10 years.
Here's another question. This is from Caitlin. She says, do you think Nancy Reagan would have ever run for office herself?
Absolutely not. And she also, if you were to suggest to her that there was anything feminist about her, she would have completely rejected that as well. And that's another sort of paradox of her, because this woman was incredibly aware of and incredibly comfortable with her power and perfectly happy, fearless about wielding it. And yet she styled herself as the absolute most traditional mid-century spouse ever. And one of the people that she becomes very close to, and in fact, is Carol McCain, who is John McCain's first wife, who, when McCain splits for marriage, Nancy takes Carol under her wing. She becomes her traveling companion for the 1980 campaign. But Carol McCain told me she didn't want people to understand her. This was just not something she was interested in.
Why do you think that was?
I think that one of her family friends is a Academy Award winning Hollywood producer, Doug Wick. He won Best Picture for Gladiator. And he had known the Reagans since he was a child. He was one of Nancy's last visitors before she died. And he really believes it was a protective mechanism going back to the trauma and insecurity of her childhood. He said that left her with two things. One is this shell, this inability to, this unwillingness to let people get to know her until she was really comfortable with them. And the other is this incredibly acute radar about other people.
So she comes back, after those first couple of years, and then, public opinion on her shifts. Talk about sort of the second term. And then, of course, we get embroiled in Iran-Contra. But for Nancy Reagan in particular, You have a great quote in the book from Ellen Goodman, who said at some point, a friend had said she had stopped crying and she started to cope. And I guess, learning how to cope with things that were going on in the White House and maybe not take so much incoming fire. How did she sort of transition from first term to second term in her own sort of persona?
Well, first of all, in 1980, she is very, very much pushing her husband to run. He had come so close to getting the nomination in 76. He's kind of waffling. She is like, this is your moment. 1984, she doesn't want him to run again. She's terrified for his physical well-being. Believe it or not, given that he ultimately won 49 states, she was worried that he couldn't win because he's coming out of this terrible recession where his numbers have been upside down for quite a bit of his first term. But he wants to run. She says, okay, whatever he wants, I'm aboard. And she really does, I think, become much more comfortable with Washington, much shrewder about her own public image. Again, everything blows up in Iran-Contra. And again, I think that chapter is the heart of the book, the degree to which she single-handedly ran the rescue effort, which all of a sudden you see public opinion of her shifts. All of a sudden, all these women writers, people like Ellen Goodman or several female columnists are going, wow, this woman did what needed to be done when all of the men around her husband completely failed him. And what you see is some of the more traditional male writers who kind of like their first ladies in a mold they recognize.
Right.
Turn on her. William Safire refers to her as an unelected, incipient Edith Wilson secretly running the country. And I'm trying to remember whether it was Safire or Scotty Reston. One of the two of them actually uses the word henpecked to describe Ronald Reagan. Nothing sexist there.
Wow. You also write about, the little things that she did. For instance, you talk about the disastrous debate and his re-election debate in St. Louis, and how she basically said to the aides that were prepping him for the next debate, let Ronnie be Ronnie. She was constantly trying to inject herself, but to have her husband be more authentic and, her confidence in his ability to kind of be fine, right? And when put on public pressure and not to be overly prepped. And she knew how to convey that.
Well, first of all, can I just say, James Baker to this day is still angry at how Nancy Reagan came down. He was doing debate prep. She comes down on him with both feet. You prepared him all wrong.
It was never Reagan's fault.
No, it was never. And James Baker would say, we prepared him exactly the way we did in 1980. He was just lazy and didn't do the work, which, by the way, you see that a lot with incumbent presidents.
Yes,
Obama's was terrible. Carter's was terrible.
Yeah.
Jerry Ford's, they don't do the work.
Right.
But she does insist that, and she's trying to get the guy who was really running the debate prep named Richard Darman, she's trying to get him fired. And Baker says, I'm not firing him. The president has to fire him. And he said, I knew he wouldn't fire him. He couldn't fire anybody. But she does insist that they do it completely differently. They bring in, of all people, Roger Ailes to sort of, and they sort of, for number one, they dial back the amount of materials they're inundating him with. They really build his confidence. And they really send out for the second debate a Ronald Reagan who is a totally different person from the guy who was stumbling around in the first debate against Walter Mondale and had all kinds of people raising questions about whether he was too old at the age of 74 or 73 to be president. Now, of course, that feels like a spring chicken.
Exactly. Here's a question from Norma Jean Kelly. She says, are all the designer clothes now in the Reagan Library? Where are the designer clothes?
You know, that is a good question. There's a lot of them. I mean, her inauguration ball gowns in the Smithsonian. There are some on display in the Reagan Library. One of the things that is really interesting is, so in 1982, she swears off borrowing clothes. She's not going to do it anymore. Well, 1988, they find out she's been borrowing them still left and right. And she would also like not report gifts like the law requires. So Fred Fielding, who was the White House counsel, told me that he would actually send lawyers from the White House counsel's office through the residence a couple of times a year, just looking for unreported. Anyway, at the end of his presidency, they find out she has in fact been borrowing clothes. It's unclear whether it violates the law. It actually doesn't violate the law in reporting gifts, but you know what it violates?
Taxes.
The tax laws.
Yeah.
The IRS launches an investigation. Shortly after Reagan is out of office, they come up with an estimate that essentially they have $3 million in unreported gifts. These clothes, I mean, you have all these IRS agents, you know, who wouldn't know, you know, Pierre Cardin from,
right.
you know, Talbot's having to sort of figure out the value of all these clothes. But they have to pay taxes on $3 million worth of unreported gifts.
And they weren't independent. I mean, when he left the White House, they were not independently wealthy. He actually had to go out and do speeches and was criticized for some of that as well, right?
Right. I mean, they were not poor, obviously, but
they were used to a certain lifestyle that they would not have been able to cut up with.
They were running around with their friends were extremely wealthy people.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's high earning years, which were really the late 50s, the early 60s, when he was the host of General Electric Theater. Those were decades behind him. So one of the first things they do are some controversial moves, including a trip to Japan where he accepts $2 million in speaking fees. Now, mind you, ex-presidents these days give six-figure, even seven-figure speeches all the time. Nobody raises an eyebrow. But at the time, that becomes very, very controversial. And, you know, he sells his memoir for a lot of money. She sells hers for a lot of money. But then Reagan is so quickly incapacitated by Alzheimer's that he can't be out there raising money. And you really see at the end of his life, a lot of strains within the family over finances, because Nancy, who has had breast cancer, is absolutely terrified that her husband, despite his mental deterioration, is physically strong, that he is going to outlive her, and that she wants to make sure there are the resources there to take care of him and protect his dignity. So there become a lot of big fights within the family over money.
Yeah. And just as we close, Karen, I guess talk a little bit about, you know, the end of life and, you know, his Alzheimer's diagnosis and how she handled that with him, and how she even, you know, told him about the diagnosis in such a way that wouldn't alarm him.
Yeah, and I lay out as dispassionately as I could.
Yeah. Because
people will debate forever whether Reagan was showing signs of it in office.
Yeah.
So read the book.
Yeah.
But, you know, by 1992, he is beginning to not know where he is at times, not recognize people at times. By 1994, the diagnosis is clear. They decide he's going to have to withdraw from public life. He writes that incredibly poignant letter to the country. Interestingly, he asked them then to type it up, at which point they said, no, the country really needs to see this in your handwriting. But then and I go into great detail in the book of what Nancy Reagan's life was like as this man to whom she is so devoted gets to the point by the end of the 90s where he doesn't know who she is. She cannot have a conversation with him. And it is, she just had always thought they would grow old together. They would share memories, and she is just isolated. She's just all by herself in this.
Well, Karen, you just did an amazing job with this book, and I would encourage everybody to click the link on your screen here and buy a copy. I actually listened to the audio version of it, which I thought was wonderful as well. But congratulations, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I know it consumes so much of the last several years here. So it's great that it's finally out and we can all benefit from reading it. And thanks for spending some time with us tonight. I want to let everybody know next week we are going to talk to former Congresswoman Jane Harman about women and national security and her new book on that topic. So we hope you all will join us next Wednesday at the same time as well. So hope everybody has a good week. Thank you.